students, I welcome you all to the course on Statistical Methods for Psychological Research Part 2. In this lesson, we are going to learn the importance of studying the null and alternative hypothesis for testing the two different sample means between two dependent samples or correlated means. Let us begin with learning objectives. The null and alternative hypothesis is framed for two dependent samples: drawing random sampling distribution from the normal population, obtaining the test statistic for two dependent samples through standard error. In this video, we are going to see particularly on the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis for two sample dependent sample. In psychological tests, we come across many real life situations where the conditions of independent samples will not hold true. In such circumstance, one has to apply dependent sample t-test. When samples are said to be independent, the element in one sample is not related to one of each other. Statistical hypothesis. It is formal approach to decide whether there is a difference between two interpretations of statistical relation between samples. One is called the null hypothesis and the other is called the alternative hypothesis. Hypothesis testing. In statistical hypothesis testing, there is a rule or procedure which makes an assumption about the population parameter to take a decision about accepting or rejecting the hypothesis. The hypothesis may be a null hypothesis may be accepted, or an alternative may be accepted, or we can reject the null or alternative. Steps to conducting a statistical test. The statistical test mainly involves the following steps. Framing the null and alternative hypothesis is the first step. The second step is fixing the level of significance and knowing the sampling distribution of the test statistic, and finally we establish a decision rule that leads to an inductive inference about the fact. These are the 5 principal steps we have to follow for any statistical test. Null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a hypothesis of no difference or status quo is maintained. A null hypothesis is always denoted by H0. In the case of two sample test, one can frame the null hypothesis as there is no difference between the two groups of a population mean. Alternative hypothesis. In alternative hypothesis, the null hypothesis complements each other. Here we frame an alternative hypothesis such as there is always denoted by H1 or HA. Here the alternative hypothesis denoted by there is a difference between the two groups of a population mean. Null and alternative hypothesis. The null and alternative hypothesis are distinguished by the use of two different symbols, H0 representing the null hypothesis and H1 representing the alternative hypothesis. Assumptions. The dependent variables must be continuous. The observation must be depend on each other. The dependent variable must be normally distributed. The variables do not contain any outliers. These are the 4 important assumptions we have to follow whenever we applying the two sample dependent t-test. Example. Consider a situation when we want to find out whether extra coaching has benefited the students or not. We shall set up a null and alternative hypothesis as follows. Extra coaching has not benefited the students, which is called the null hypothesis. The another example is extra coaching has benefited the students. If we want to find out whether a particular drug is effective in curing malaria, we will take the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis as such. The drug is not effective in curing malaria. The drug is effective in curing malaria, which are the null and alternative hypothesis. A psychologist is interested in testing the sample. The teacher in a classroom wants to test if the student's IQ level is higher than 100 or not. He or she might establish the null and alternative hypothesis. The teacher is interested in testing the difference between two group means IQ level of students through control group and experimental group. The psychologist may like to establish the null hypothesis that the two groups have equal means, that is, mu1 minus mu2 equal to 0 or mu1 is equal to mu2, and the alternative hypothesis that their means are not equal, that is mu1 minus mu2 not equal to 0 or mu1 is not equal to mu2. Here h naught mu is 100, which is called as a null hypothesis, and h1, the alternative hypothesis, mu is not equal to 100 is alternative hypothesis. Here one can take mu is less than 100 or mu is greater than 100 for the alternative hypothesis. It depends upon the researcher. Here the mean IQ level is higher than or lower than the mean score, what we said fixed for the alternative hypothesis. Let us summarize what we have learned in this video. In this video, we come across the null and alternative hypothesis for two sample dependent t-test. Further, we have studied the importance of assumptions involved in the two dependent sample test, and we have learned some example how to frame the null and alternative hypothesis. Let us continue in the next video. Thank you.